All right, welcome back. So this is actually going to be the last video before the start of the actual course. So the next video I upload will actually just begin the course in Chapter 1, first video of Chapter 1. So I recorded a long time ago. Actually look a little bit fatter in those videos. But yeah, so that's basically, the course will start with the next video. But for this video, there's something I wanted to talk about that I gained greater understanding of, not only after learning more about the subconscious, but actually after experiencing it myself through a very sort of crazy time for me. But I want to talk about, or one thing I didn't want to put this in when I talked about the nature of emotions in that video, but one thing that is going to be relevant to understanding the nature of the subconscious is depression and anxiety, right? So that's basically what I wanted to cover in this video. So that basically is another thing you're going to be better able to understand, right? Because like I said, emotions come from the subconscious. So if that's true, right, you should be able to explain and understand the nature of depression and anxiety by understanding the nature of the subconscious, right? And that's exactly what I'm saying will happen, right? Or at least my theory explains the nature of emotion and anxiety more clearly and succinctly, I believe, than the materialist model. And so, I think it's important, right? And I didn't put this in the book, because I didn't put in the book because I wanted it to, I kind of didn't really feel comfortable because I don't want to feel like I'm giving medical advice, right? And I want to make that clear, like nothing I say on these channels should be taken as medical advice. If you're suffering from any illness or any disease, mentally, physically, right, you should see a licensed doctor, right? A licensed therapist, whatever, right? Well, I don't want to say therapist, but a licensed, you should see a licensed professional for help, right? And the reason I say that is because I have a lot of issues with, I have a lot of personal beliefs. Again, not medical advice, but I have personal beliefs about therapy and things like that. I think a lot of these disciplines are incomplete because they're based on materialist ideas. Materialist ideas never going to truly be able to help you, right? Because you are not material, right? You consist of metaphysical substances, or I don't know what the word is. I was going to say immaterial. That's not quite the right word. But you consist of spiritual substances, spiritual materials, right? And so you're not going to be able to, you're just never going to be able to fully explain the mind and, certain behaviors of the mind using a purely materialist model, right? It's just never going to happen, right? It's why there's no concise theory on emotions, right? Nothing everyone agrees upon, right? There are theories like Cannon-Bard. I'm trying to think of one of the earliest theories of emotion, and at least in the modern version of psychology, which was like absurd, right? But it was an early time. Was it Cannon-Bard? I forgot them. All right, I read up on them. But anyway, yeah, one of the theories was that that theories correspond purely to emotional states. Makes no sense, right? Another theory was that maybe they're a mixture of physical and emotional states, which is true, but there's still things they can't explain because they're assuming, mental states, I meant to say. They're assuming that the mental states are still a reflection of a physical state, which they're not, right? And so none of the theories on emotion, creativity, like I said, being in the zone, none of them are complete, and scientists even still to this day do not have a complete theory of these things. They think it's just because we don't know everything about the brain. No, right? It's because the brain, that these things do not exclusively come from the brain. The brain impacts these things, yes, but they do not come from the brain, right? And so they don't provide a complete model. And so I say all that to say, I have a very, what's the word? Criticizing opinion. I don't know if that doesn't really make sense, but I think you get what I'm trying to say, right? I am very critical of psychology and modern psychology and therapy and things like that because I think of them as being, I think of it as being a kind of belief system that is based almost on like superstitious beliefs, right? And I'll talk more about this later, but I think it's a belief system that is based on almost like the religious belief that we're not materials, right? It's not really science. It's just based on what you believe, what you're hoping, what you believe to be true about reality in a faith-like way that isn't based on science. So what I do is I actually talk. Now, I'm not a psychologist or therapist. I'm sure they know a lot more than me about the mind, and they know more about experimental psychology and these studies and things like that, although I know a little bit about that stuff. The difference, however, is I think my theory is still superior, right? Because I actually look at the more complete model of the mind, which includes the subconscious and recognizes that it is metaphysical, right? And so I say all of that to say, right, that people, basically, before I go forward, let me just say that I had an experience, right, where I experienced depression and anxiety. Now, I never really experienced any of that almost my entire life. Right? I had a million reasons, right, to be depressed, but I just never was. I was never that type of person. Like, I don't know, my personality just doesn't really, it's not vulnerable to those feelings, and I've had moments, sure, of depression, but I've never, very, very rare. It's like pretty much, I think only happened 2 times in my life. There's one time I remember, but I think there was another time. I just don't remember it. But yeah, so I'm not really a depressed person. When people would talk about depression, had no idea really what they were talking about. With anxiety, I definitely have experienced anxiety, but I haven't experienced what's called generalized anxiety disorder, which is basically when you're feeling anxiety all the time. My anxiety is mostly in social circumstances and especially with public speaking, right? So I'm not good with public speaking, right? Which is why I didn't really want to make videos or anything. Videos are not as bad for me, but if I have to get in front of a group and speak, I'm terrible, I'll go into I don't know if I'll still do it now, but when I was younger, I used to get panic attacks. But suffice it to say, right? I have learned more about both of these things because I experienced them. So I experienced it during a time in my life, which I'll talk more about that later, when I had sleep apnea. Well, I guess I still have sleep apnea, right? It doesn't really go away, but it's a lot better now than it was at this time, right? And there was a reason why I had it, right? So sleep apnea normally, if you have it, right, you just have it for life. It doesn't really get better, right? But for me, it did for a certain reason, right? And there's no real reason to go into that now. But yeah, during the time, my sleep apnea was really bad, right? I couldn't sleep. Was going through a really rough time spiritually, right? That's a long explanation, right? And I ended up, and I had a spiritual experience during that time too, a lot of spiritual experiences. Again, there's a lot I could say about that. But suffice it to say, right, during this time I experienced, basically, actually, before I say that, if you don't know what sleep apnea is basically when you're unable to breathe. You're not able to get enough oxygen while you're sleeping, right? So it can occur in 2 different ways. If I remember the names correctly, one is obstructive sleep apnea, I think, and the other one is central sleep apnea. So basically, with central sleep apnea, it basically happens when your brain is not sending a signal to your body or your lungs to breathe, which is really dangerous, or your diaphragm, whatever, is your body is basically not breathing. It's not inhaling and exhaling properly. Now, that's central sleep apnea. That's really dangerous, right? Because your brain is just not sending any signal. Now, with obstructive sleep apnea, is because your airway is closed, right? So oxygen's trying to get in, but not that much can get in because your airway is closed, right? There's not enough volume. And so that's the one most common. That's the one that I had. And so when that happens, right, your body starts to go into panic attack. Because when your body senses that you're not getting enough oxygen, which is very dangerous, right, it releases adrenaline. And so your breathing effort increases because of the adrenaline. It increases your heart rate and you start breathing more, right? You start breathing more heavily to get more air in. Problem with that is that it makes it harder to sleep, as you would expect, right? And so there are many symptoms of being in that state and experiencing that. And for me, I experienced depression and anxiety, right? So for the first time in my life, I really experienced them in that form, right? Which was crazy. And so let me just say that I used to think that when a person was depressed, right, it was because they were just sort of thinking too much, they were kind of inside their head too much, and they were thinking too negatively, right? I think a lot of people think that, but no, right? So depression, I learned, right, that depression don't get me wrong, it could be caused by that, and that why that is will make more sense with what we talk about later. But no, right, depression almost has nothing to do with that, right? Depression is more or less brought on by the state of your body, right? So it's a reflection, more or less, of a physiological state. It is definitely a reflection of your subconscious state, but it's not quite that simple. So, when I experienced that, I basically had a better understanding of what's actually happening during depression and anxiety. And I'll just say, right, I used to control my subconscious to feel emotions all the time, right? I still do it for the most part, but when I'm free, because I'm usually so busy, when I'm free enough to do it, I just, I bring myself closer to the presence of God. That's how I use my subconscious all the time, right? Sometimes I still do emotions, like I'll pick a random emotion to increase the feeling of, just if I just want to feel good in that way, right? Put myself in a good mood. But a lot of times I'll just feel the presence of God, right? Because that just feels awesome, like so amazing. But yeah, so, I used to do that all the time with my emotions. And so you would think, if I know how to do that, well, then I can't experience depression and anxiety, right? Because I could just make myself feel better, right? And you would be shocked, at least I was shocked, at how much that didn't really help me, right? At least in the beginning, right? Like you would think like, well, why don't you just control your emotions like you said you could? Because you can't really do it in that state, right? And that's what I learned. I never knew that. So I haven't set up the theory yet, right? You haven't learned the theory. You haven't taken the course yet. So there's a lot to explain. I do talk about it again, of course. That's basically what this video is for. So I'm going to talk about depression and anxiety in chapter 14, right, in book 1. So there I'm going to talk about what anxiety is, how depression works, which by that time you'll kind of already understand it, because we've already gone through all the principles. But I just talked about it in that one section specifically. So you're going to understand how that stuff works, what causes it. There are different causes, right? And I talk about what causes it in terms of the subconscious, right? So I'm sure there's various physical things that can cause it. By the way, there's also spiritual things that can cause depression, like negative entities. That's another thing they pretend doesn't exist in psychology and therapy, so people don't get the help that they need. And I talk more about that in book 2. A little more, not like a lot, but a little bit more about that in book 2. But suffice it to say, I'm going to cover those topics, at least my understanding of them, in chapter 14. But I did eventually, because I understood how the subconscious worked, right, when I was experiencing this, I noticed my subconscious wasn't doing the things it wasn't responding in the way it normally responded. That's why I couldn't just make myself feel more emotions, right? Normally, when I tell my subconscious what to do, it does exactly what I say, right? So if I say to do like this, then it'll do like this. But during this time, I noticed when I would do these same techniques to control my subconscious, if I say do like this, now it's doing like this. It's like not quite moving as fast as it should, right? It's like much harder to get it to just do that, right? And it's like not listen. It's not that it's not listening as much, and it'll make more sense later. It's like it's in quicksand, right? Or something's like, it's like it has like what do they call it? Like ankle weights or something, like, or a weighted vest. It's like it can't move as fluidly as normal. That's actually what happens when you are depressed or feeling anxiety. That's why you don't feel emotions. That's why when you're depressed, it's like you can't feel any emotion, right? That's actually because your subconscious it has weights on it. It can't move and flow as much, right? And that was the first thing I noticed when I was in this state, right? And eventually, I did learn how to control my subconscious in such a way where I could get out of that state, right? So basically, I cured myself of depression and anxiety just from knowing how to control my subconscious, right? So basically, I just make this video to say, well, for one, to say that I'm going to talk about this stuff later, but also for people who do suffer from depression and anxiety, it might be helpful to have a better understanding of why you're experiencing that. Like I said, a lot of people will think it's them. There's something they need to do, in that if they would just think more positively, right, they can get rid of it. It's not quite that simple. Like, it's really not, right? And you're going to understand more later. Now, in psychology and therapy, they should be telling people these things. At least I believe what I'm saying is correct, right? So I believe they should be telling people these things. But they don't. And I believe it causes so many problems for people, because people are kind of suffering more than they have to, because modern science, as it relates to the mind, is just based on kind of superstition, right? This idea that there's no metaphysical, and I know that's kind of the reverse of how superstition is usually used. And I talk a little more about that in chapter 16. I forgot to mention, in chapter 16, I talk about God, but I talk about philosophical arguments for God. So I actually don't talk about the subconscious almost at all in that chapter, but I just talk about philosophical arguments for God, right? And I talk about the concept of superstition in a slightly different way. But that's how I think of them, right? They have the belief that there's nothing metaphysical and everything's materialistic is practically a superstitious belief, right? And it causes so many problems because you're using this form of superstition, and it's almost like a religious belief because it's a form of faith, to have faith in materials, that the answer will always lie with materials, right? You're using that in the place of real science. Real science would look at the data and would analyze it and recognize there is metaphysical does exist, right? And if at least you believe that, now you can start studying it and analyzing it. That's what I did, right? And so that's why I just want to say in this video that I believe a lot of people kind of suffer needlessly because of modern society's stance on the mind and believing that it's a materialistic substance, which it's not, right? And they suffer greatly, right? And I believe these ideas can help people, right? So now, one thing again, I just want to make clear, I cured, because I know how these principles work, right? So when I experienced depression and anxiety, when I had sleep apnea, right, I didn't know exactly what to do right away, but I understood the problem. And so I'm using my knowledge and my understanding of the subconscious. I'm like, okay, what might I need to do to solve this problem? And then I came up with the plan or the solution, put the plan into action. It took me about a month. Then I cured my depression and anxiety. Because I had predicted, like, okay, if my theory is correct, if I do this particular thing, which I had no reason, I never did it before, because I didn't have a reason to do that with my subconscious. But this time I did. So I'm like, if I do this with my subconscious mind, then this should be the outcome, right? Which, again, I've never tried it, so I don't know. But I did it, and everything worked exactly as I predicted, right? And so I cured myself with depression and anxiety. Now, I just want to say that's what I did. Now, I can't give medical advice, right? Nor do I want to, right? So still, if you suffer from these things, see a licensed professional, right, for help. The correctly licensed professional for help, not me, right? I'm just giving information about what I did and my thoughts on it, but it shouldn't be taken as medical advice. So yeah, I think that's it. That's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else that I wanted to say. No, I think that's it. So yeah. Oh yeah, one other thing I wanted to say is in the videos you're gonna see me wearing a hat a lot, right? Now my hairline is kind of messed up. You can kind of see right here it's kind of messed up. So I like to wear a hat. But the thing is that in a lot of the videos, because I'm so used to being in the man cave, right? I've been studying this stuff for years. In a lot of the videos I don't get a haircut, right? So I look kind of like something coming out of the jungle or something, right? Like some uncivilized man, right, living in the jungle, a lot of times. But yeah, so I just want to give also that disclaimer, that heads up, right? Especially I think around like chapter 13, I think. I'm like, man, because when I'm going through my videos and when I was editing them, I'm looking through my videos, I'm like, that's crazy. I'm like, I really should have gotten a haircut for the camera, right? But, I'm just so immersed in this stuff, right? In the theory and making the videos and trying to get this stuff done that, again, it's a long story on why, right? I was trying to get it done so much and, how I came to understand these ideas and things like that. That's a long story in itself. But suffice it to say that I was trying to just get these videos done as quickly as possible. And I've been kind of just there, kind of creating this theory over the years and, developing it more and more and more, so I was like in a state where I was kind of in a place where getting a haircut wasn't really that important to me, right? But now I'm on camera, I'm like, I look like, I was going to say something, but it's like I said, suffice it to say, I look like, I didn't evolve with the rest of the population, right? I look like a caveman, but yeah, so, it is what it is, I'm giving a heads up, right? In the later videos, I believe I do start getting haircuts more often. But yeah, you're going to see that. What else? And yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I said, the videos are not going to be spruced up very much because I don't know how to do that stuff. And that's not my skill. And, in some cases I look like a caveman. But I do like to wear a hat to cover my hairline. I'll probably wear those more in the future. But wear a hat more in the future. But yeah, that's it. So in the next video, is going to be the beginning of chapter 1, right? And then, I'll upload everything to the last chapter. And then when I get a chance, I'm going to make a video on magic theory, or how magic works. I'm going to talk about positive supernaturalism and negative supernaturalism. But yeah, that's it for now, though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.